There are moments when kindness starts to feel like a room with no door. You keep showing up, you keep listening, you keep smoothing over the sharp edges, translating their moods, making excuses for what hurt you, trying to be patient enough, understanding enough, easy enough, good enough. And somewhere along the way, without ever meaning to, your kindness stops feeling like love and starts feeling like a quiet form of disappearance. You can feel it in the body before you can explain it in words. The tightness in the chest when your phone lights up. The way your stomach drops before you even read the message. The strange exhaustion that comes from being the one who always has to stay calm, stay soft, stay available, stay reasonable. It does not feel heroic anymore. It feels like you are slowly stepping out of yourself to keep someone else comfortable. And that is where the pain becomes complicated, because people praise you for the very thing that is draining you. They call you generous. They call you understanding. They call you the one who gets it. But what they do not see is that your understanding has become a hiding place for other people's behavior. Your generosity has become the place where your own needs go unanswered. Your kindness has become a habit of self-erasure. This is where many people misunderstand the pattern. They think the problem is that you are too kind. It is not. Kindness is not the wound. The wound is when kindness is no longer connected to self-respect. The wound is when compassion turns into permission. The wound is when you keep offering warmth to a person who has trained you to abandon yourself in order to keep the peace. Carl Jung would have recognized the deeper mechanism here immediately. Not because he would reduce your suffering to a label, but because he understood how the psyche builds roles, how a person can become trapped inside a persona, how the good one, the easy one, the strong one, the understanding one, can become a mask so convincing that even you forget it is a mask. A persona is not fake in the simple sense. It is often built from something real. You may genuinely be caring. You may genuinely be sensitive. You may genuinely hate conflict and want harmony. But when the persona grows too large, it begins to demand sacrifice. It starts telling you that your peace is less important than their comfort, that your boundaries are selfish, that your discomfort must be swallowed if the relationship is to survive. And because the persona was built to keep you accepted, it becomes terrifying to question it. So you keep saying yes when you mean no. You keep explaining when you should be stepping back. You keep forgiving before anything has actually changed. You keep hoping that if you are patient enough, the other person will finally meet you with the same care you keep giving them. But the deeper truth is more uncomfortable. Sometimes your kindness is not being received as love. It is being received as availability. And availability, when it has no boundary around it, can invite a very specific kind of dynamic. Not always a cruel one, not always an obvious one, but a dynamic in which the other person learns, consciously or unconsciously, that your empathy will absorb what they do not want to face, that your patience will outlast their accountability, that your softness will keep the connection alive, even when they are not truly tending to it. This is why some people become more careless the more understanding they are given. Not because they are monsters, not because every difficult person has some grand evil plan, but because the psyche is opportunistic. If one person keeps over-functioning, another person may keep under-functioning. If one person keeps repairing, another person may stop learning how to repair anything at all. And then the relationship begins to revolve around your nervous system. You start reading the room before you read yourself. You start managing their moods before you notice your own. You start carrying the emotional weather of the entire connection as if it were your job. If they are distant, you become more gentle. If they are irritated, you become quieter. If they withdraw, you try harder to be safe. If they are cold, you warm yourself against the cold and call it maturity. But this is not maturity. This is often a survival strategy dressed up as virtue. And that distinction matters. Because there is a kind of goodness that comes from wholeness, and there is a kind of goodness that comes from fear. One is rooted in choice. The other is rooted in the terror of being rejected, misunderstood, or left. One says, I can care without losing myself. The other says, If I do not care enough, I will not be kept. That second one is where the abandonment complex begins to speak. You may not think of it as an abandonment complex. You may just think you are loyal, or patient, or a person who does not give up easily. But if the fear underneath your kindness is, if I stop being useful, I will be left, then you are not only loving, you are negotiating for safety, and that negotiation can become exhausting. You can see it in small moments, the delayed reply that ruins your afternoon, the tiny shift in tone that sends your mind into overanalysis, the way you rewrite your own feelings to make their behavior seem less painful, the way you tell yourself you are overreacting, when in fact your body is picking up on a pattern your mind does not want to admit yet. This is where projection enters the room. Projection is one of those Jungian ideas that sounds abstract until you feel it in your own life. We do not only see the other person as they are, we also see them through what they awaken in us. We project our hopes, our wounds, our fantasies, our unfinished needs. Sometimes we project goodness onto someone because we need them to be safe. Sometimes we project depth onto someone because we need the relationship to mean something. Sometimes we project our own neglected worth onto a person who gives us just enough attention to keep us hoping. And then we stay too long, not because the connection is truly nourishing, but because we are attached to the image we have built inside it. That image can be powerful. It can feel sacred. It can feel like proof that the connection is special. But if you are honest, you may notice that what is keeping you there is not only the person in front of you, it is the meaning you have assigned to them. It is the version of yourself you become when you are trying to earn care from them. It is the old story that says love must be proved through endurance. That story is ancient. It lives in the collective unconscious in many forms. The one who waits, the one who saves, the one who suffers quietly and is finally rewarded. The one who keeps the family together, the one who absorbs the pain so nobody else has to feel it. These are not random personal habits. They are archetypal roles. And because they are archetypal, they can feel noble even when they are hurting you. So the question is not simply, why are they like this? The question is, why does my psyche keep assigning me this role? That is the turning point. Because once you see the role, you can begin to see the cost of it. You can begin to notice how many times you have called self-abandonment by a softer name, how often you have called overgiving love, how often you have called over-explaining communication, how often you have called tolerating disrespect being mature. And maybe, if you are very honest, you can remember the moment when your kindness first became dangerous to you. Maybe it was in a family where your feelings were too much, so you learned to be helpful instead. Maybe you became the peacemaker, the one who could read everyone else's mood, the one who knew how to make things lighter. Maybe being good got you less trouble, less criticism, less tension. Maybe you learned that your safety depended on being easy to handle. If that is true, then your current relationships are not happening in a vacuum. They are touching an old pattern, a complex. A complex is not just an idea, it is an emotional knot, a cluster of memory, fear, expectation, and bodily reaction that gets activated when something in the present resembles something unresolved in the past. That is why a small act of distance can feel enormous. That is why a cold reply can feel like a verdict. That is why a person's inconsistency can pull you into a storm that feels older than the relationship itself. You are not only reacting to today, you are reacting to every time you had to earn tenderness, every time you had to become smaller to keep connection. Every time your needs were treated like an inconvenience. Every time you learned that being loved meant being manageable. And now, because the old wound is active, kindness can become the very thing that keeps the wound open. You keep offering understanding to someone who is not meeting you halfway, because somewhere inside you still believe that if you are gentle enough, the pain will turn into closeness. But pain does not automatically become intimacy. Sometimes, pain simply becomes repetition. This is where people often get trapped in the fantasy of being the one who can heal the dynamic through love alone. They think, if I just stay calm, if I just do not react, if I just explain it one more time, if I just love better, everything will soften. But a psyche cannot be rescued by your overfunctioning. A relationship cannot become healthy because one person keeps carrying what belongs to two. And if there is a manipulative pattern in the connection, your kindness may be used to keep it alive. Not always in a dramatic way, sometimes in very ordinary ways. They know you will answer. They know you will forgive. They know you will make the first move after tension. They know your empathy is easier to access than your anger. So they keep the door open just enough. A message here, a warm memory there, a hint of regret, a little affection after a cold stretch. And because your heart is sincere, you keep believing the warmth means change. But warmth is not the same as transformation. This is one of the hardest lessons for kind people to learn. The presence of emotion does not mean the presence of accountability. The presence of longing does not mean the presence of readiness. The presence of chemistry does not mean the presence of care. Jung's language helps here because it gives us a way to see the inner drama without turning every person into a villain. The point is not to demonize the other. The point is to see the unconscious choreography, the way one person's persona meets another person's wound, the way one person's avoidance meets another person's rescue instinct, the way one person's emptiness can be fed by another person's endless giving. And then both people are caught in roles they did not consciously choose, but keep reenacting because the pattern feels familiar. Familiar does not mean healthy. Familiar only means the psyche recognizes the script. You may have noticed that when you finally start to pull back, guilt appears almost immediately. Not only sadness, guilt. A strange, irrational guilt, as if setting a boundary is the same as becoming cruel, as if saying no is the same as betraying love, as if protecting yourself means you have become cold. This is where the persona of the good person fights for survival. It says, if you stop rescuing, who are you? It says, if you stop explaining, will they think you do not care? It says, if you stop being available, are you abandoning them? It says, if you choose yourself, are you becoming selfish? And that is exactly why guilt can feel so intense when you begin to change. Because the new behavior is not only new, it is threatening an identity. The identity of the person who is always understanding. The identity of the person who never makes things difficult. The identity of the person who can absorb almost anything and still smile. But here is the deeper truth. Guilt is not always a reliable moral compass. Sometimes, guilt is simply the sound of an old role losing control. If your kindness has been trained to override your boundaries, then the first time you honor your boundary, it may feel wrong. Your body may interpret dignity as danger. Your mind may call self-protection selfish. Your nervous system may panic because it is no longer receiving the familiar signal that you are being useful enough to stay safe. That does not mean the boundary is wrong. It means the boundary is new, and new boundaries often feel like loss before they feel like relief. This is why the shift can be so subtle from the outside and so seismic on the inside. You do not suddenly become a different person. You begin by noticing. Noticing the ache after the conversation. Noticing the resentment under the politeness. Noticing the part of you that is tired of being the one who keeps the connection alive. Noticing that your kindness is no longer peaceful. It is tense. It is vigilant. It is waiting for the next emotional task. Once you notice that, you cannot fully unsee it. And that is where the psyche begins to reorganize. Because the self, in Jungian terms, is not interested in keeping you trapped in a role that is slowly draining your life. The self is the deeper center of the psyche that pushes toward wholeness, even when that pressure feels uncomfortable. Sometimes it does that by making the old pattern unbearable. Sometimes it does that by making you tired of your own performance. Sometimes it does that by letting the mask slip just enough for you to see what it costs to keep wearing it. Maybe that is why certain relationships become impossible to continue in the same way. Not because you suddenly stopped caring, but because your deeper self has started to refuse the bargain. The bargain was this: I will be easy if you will be loving. I will be patient if you will be consistent. I will understand if you will meet me halfway. I will keep the peace if you will not make me feel alone in it. And then one day you realize the bargain has not been honored. That realization can be devastating. It can also be liberating. Because once you stop confusing your sacrifice with love, you begin to recover your discernment. You begin to see that care without reciprocity is not a virtue to be endlessly praised. It is a pattern to be examined. You begin to understand that your empathy is sacred only when it does not require you to disappear. This is not about becoming hard. It is not about punishing anyone. It is not about turning your heart into armor. The point is not to betray your softness in the opposite direction. The point is to let softness live beside boundaries. A boundary is not a wall. It is a line that says, "This is where I end and you begin." Without that line, empathy becomes fusion. Without that line, kindness becomes compliance. Without that line, love becomes a place where your own life slowly goes quiet. And maybe that is the sentence you have been avoiding. Your life has been going quiet, not in a dramatic collapse, in a slow, almost invisible way. A little less energy here, a little less joy there, a little less honesty, a little less spontaneity, a little less appetite for your own future, because so much of your attention has been tied up in keeping someone else emotionally comfortable that you have been living from the outside in. There is a reason this feels so heavy. It is because the psyche knows when it is not being inhabited fully. It knows when you are performing your role more than you are living your truth. And the cost of that performance is not only emotional, it is bodily. Tight jaw, held breath, fatigue that sleep does not fix, the sense of waking up already braced, the feeling that you are always a little bit behind your own life. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself somewhere private. I am tired of kindness that requires me to abandon myself. Just that. No performance, no explanation, just the truth. Because truth changes the inner atmosphere. Not instantly, not magically, but honestly. And once truth enters, the old spell starts to weaken. You begin to see that what looked like devotion may have been self-erasure. What looked like loyalty may have been fear. What looked like compassion may have been a way to stay attached to people who could not hold your depth. What looked like being the bigger person may have been your shadow trying to keep the peace at any cost. Yes, shadow. Because the shadow is not only cruelty, rage, or selfishness. Sometimes the shadow contains the anger you were not allowed to have, the instinct to say no, the refusal to absorb another person's chaos, the part of you that knows you do not owe endless access to anyone. If that part has been pushed down for years, it may emerge as guilt, irritability, numbness, or sudden coldness when you finally reach your limit. And people may misunderstand that too. They may say you have changed. They may say you have become distant. They may say you are not as warm as you used to be. But what if what they call coldness is simply the first honest temperature you have had in years? What if that distance is not cruelty, but your psyche stepping back from a fire that was burning too close to your skin? This matters, because many empathic people are taught to fear their own distance. They think distance means failure. They think distance means they no longer care. They think if they are not constantly emotionally available, they are becoming like the very people who hurt them. But distance can be sacred. Distance can be clarity. Distance can be the space in which projection begins to fall away. When you are always right there, always responding, always explaining, the other person never has to meet the reality of your absence. They only meet your function. But when you step back, the function disappears. The role stops feeding the dynamic. The pattern loses its fuel. And then you get to see something important. What remains when your overgiving is no longer available? That answer can be painful. It can also be clean. Because some connections survive only because one person is doing the emotional labor of two. And once that labor stops, the truth becomes visible. Not always in the form of a dramatic ending, sometimes in the form of silence, sometimes in the form of discomfort, sometimes in the form of realizing that the relationship was never built on mutuality in the first place. That realization is not a failure. It is information. And information is what frees you from fantasy. The fantasy says, if I keep being kind, they will finally become safe. The reality says, my kindness cannot manufacture what is missing. The fantasy says, if I hold on long enough, it will soften. The reality says, I cannot keep calling pain by the name of love. The fantasy says, maybe I am just too sensitive. The reality says, my sensitivity is not the problem, my self-abandonment is. That last one can sting, because it asks you to stop blaming your nature and start noticing your pattern. But that is not blame, that is power. Because if your pattern is part of the pain, then your pattern can also be changed. You do not need to become a different species of person. You do not need to become cold, suspicious, or closed. You need something subtler and more difficult. A relationship with yourself strong enough that your empathy no longer overrides your inner truth. That is individuation in plain language. Individuation is not becoming perfect. It is not becoming detached from all feeling. It is the slow process of becoming whole enough that you are no longer split between what you feel and what you allow. It is the moment when your inner life stops bowing to the demands of an old role. It is when the self begins to ask for a more honest life, even if that honesty costs you the comfort of being liked. And yes, that can mean losing certain people's approval. It can mean they prefer the version of you that was easier to manage. It can mean they do not know what to do with your no. It can mean your calm boundary feels like a threat to the dynamic they depended on. It can mean you are no longer rewarding the patterns that kept you emotionally exhausted. But your responsibility is not to remain useful to your own detriment. Your responsibility is to remain truthful. Truthful about what hurts. Truthful about what you need. Truthful about what you can no longer carry. Truthful about the difference between compassion and self-sacrifice. There is a quiet dignity in that kind of honesty. It does not need to be loud. It does not need to be dramatic. It does not need to announce itself with anger or speeches. Sometimes it looks like fewer explanations. Sometimes it looks like slower replies. Sometimes it looks like not rushing to repair what was never repaired with you. Sometimes it looks like letting someone sit with the consequences of their own behavior without immediately cushioning the impact. That is not cruelty. That is reality. And reality is often the first thing a distorted dynamic cannot survive. Because once you stop feeding the loop, you begin to feel your own center again. Not because the other person has suddenly transformed, but because you are no longer organizing your life around their emotional state. You are no longer asking their mood to tell you who you are. You are no longer handing them the authority to define your worth through their attention. This is the part where kindness becomes something different. Not a performance, not a sacrifice, not a plea to be chosen. It becomes clean. It becomes discerning. It becomes boundaried. It becomes real. Real kindness does not require you to lie to yourself. Real kindness does not ask you to keep bleeding in silence. Real kindness does not make you responsible for another adult's refusal to meet you honestly. And if you have been living inside the old pattern for a long time, you may need to grieve that truth. Grieve the image. Grieve the hope. Grieve the version of the story in which your patience would eventually be rewarded by mutual care. Grieve the years you spent trying to make tenderness do the work of boundaries. Grief is not regression. It is the psyche telling the truth about what was lost. But after grief, something steadier can come in. You begin to notice that your nervous system is calmer when you do not explain yourself 5 times. You begin to feel stronger when you stop chasing emotional clarity from people who benefit from your confusion. You begin to understand that not every silence needs your panic. Not every distance needs your pursuit. Not every wound in another person is yours to heal. And that understanding, once it settles in, changes the way you move through the world. You stop volunteering for emotional labor that was never yours. You stop calling over-functioning love. You stop confusing your fear of loss with intuition. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. You stop offering your softest self to dynamics that keep teaching you to shrink. And perhaps, for the first time in a long time, you feel what it is like to be kind without being consumed. That feeling is quiet. It may not look dramatic, There may be no grand scene, no sudden victory, no cinematic apology. But there is a different kind of power in it. The power of not betraying yourself to keep a connection alive. The power of letting your boundary become your peace. The power of knowing that your empathy is most beautiful when it is anchored in self-respect. And if the old pattern tries to call that selfish, remember, a psyche that has been trained to survive through self-erasure will always experience wholeness as rebellion at first. Let it. Let the old role protest. Let the guilt rise and pass. Let the mask loosen. Let the room get quieter. Let the phone stay silent without turning that silence into a verdict about your worth. Because the silence is not always abandonment. Sometimes, it is the space where projection falls apart. Sometimes, it is the moment you stop being used as a mirror for someone else's unfinished life. Sometimes, it is the beginning of your return to yourself. And that return may be the most important thing you ever do. Not because it makes you harder to love, because it makes you impossible to lose inside love. My kindness no longer requires self-betrayal. Say that again, softly, without anger, not as a slogan, as a boundary, as a beginning, as a way back to your own center. And when you sit with that truth long enough, you may notice something simple and almost sacred. The body relaxes when it no longer has to keep proving it deserves care. The shoulders drop, the breath deepens, the mind stops rehearsing every conversation. The heart, though bruised, becomes clearer. That is what dignity feels like. Not coldness, not punishment, not distance for its own sake. Dignity is the moment you stop asking your pain to serve someone else's comfort. And once you know that, you cannot unknow it.